For 11 years, the wild frontier of the Montana Territory was a purgatory of dust and broken promises, a place where hope was as scarce as clean water. Throughout those years, the men who fancied themselves the pillars of that small, soot-stained community, men like the hot-tempered Sheriff Brody, watched with a mix of derision and distrust the woman who dared to defy every convention. Her name was Anya, a name that echoed of distant lands, whispered with an air of mystery and disdain, used almost as a synonym for stubbornness. Sheriff Brody, a man who looked as though he'd been carved from granite, possessed a meticulously groomed mustache and a gaze that conveyed more threat than authority. He rode his bay stallion with the posture of an emperor. His navy blue uniform, impeccably clean and starched, stood in violent contrast to the arid landscape and the ragged clothes of everyone else. His leather boots, polished to a mirror sheen under the scorching sun, shone like a beacon of his own self-importance. He represented order, the law, and above all, the illusion of control over untamable nature. Anya, by contrast, was a smudge of hard labor against the desert backdrop. She was perpetually coated in a fine, persistent layer of red earth, sweat, and clay. Her hands, thick and cracked, were a tapestry of scars and calluses, silent witnesses to a monumental effort. Her brown hair, usually bound in a tight braid and hidden under a faded kerchief, concealed the auburn highlights the Montana sun had scorched into her stray locks. She wore no gloves. She preferred to feel the texture of every stone, the grit of the wood, the dampness of the soil. Her clothing was a tangle of canvas and heavy cotton, patched countless times, yet always clean enough to denote an unwavering self-respect, even if the dust had become her second skin. The object of her martyrdom was a patch of dirt barely 2 miles from town, a lot the sheriff had publicly ridiculed as the foulest, most godforsaken swamp in Blackwater County. It was a piece of land no one wanted, a plain of scree and stunted brush adjacent to a marshland that exhaled a constant stench of peat and decay. To most, it was a wasteland fit only for mosquitoes and rattlesnakes. To Anya, it was a riddle waiting to be solved. Sheriff Brody pulled his horse to a halt at a safe distance from the mud, his face twisted in pure contempt. He hollered, his voice dripping with condescension, that she was wasting what little time she had left on that heap of trash. His lackeys, brutal, rustic men, echoed his laughter, their eyes sliding over Anya as easily as they would a rock by the roadside. They didn't see her. They only saw the madness she was trying to build. In a moment of forced silence, as Anya bent to hoist a limestone block weighing nearly 60 pounds, a small metal object slid from her pocket and hit the damp earth. It was a silver compass, ancient and ornate, etched with complex constellations and symbols that seemed to belong to a long-forgotten age. Deputy Miller, an older man with eyes that had seen more than they cared to, stood just behind the sheriff and turned ashen. His eyes widened, the color draining from his sun-bronzed face. He seemed to recognize the object, or perhaps the sigil engraved upon it, and dread spread across his features like a sudden sickness. His lips moved as if to utter a name or a warning, but the sheriff's voice cut him off abruptly. Noticing Miller's reaction, the sheriff shot him a piercing look, a silent warning. He barked in a low, authoritative tone for his subordinate to fall in line. The look he gave Miller was a reminder of his place, an unquestionable command. Miller immediately averted his eyes from the compass, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the reins, and he did not dare look again at Anya or the artifact that had revealed a fragment of her mysterious past. The sheriff hadn't even noticed the object, far too preoccupied with his own superiority to spot such insignificant details in the mud. The sun burned without mercy, and with each passing day, Anya's body became a machine of endurance and pain. Her hands, once delicate, were now as thick as buffalo hide, calloused and rough-hewn, marked by countless scratches and small nicks that never fully healed. Her fingers were knotted, her nails brittle and stained with earth. Every muscle worked in unison, yet in constant protest. The ache in her lower back was a permanent companion, a deep, radiating burn that pulsed through her spine and down her legs. It was the price of shifting a mountain of stone, of bending and twisting in agonizing positions for hours on end. She hauled rocks weighing over 100 pounds, dragging them across uneven ground, feeling the crushing weight press into her shoulders. Every breath was a conscious effort, a plea for the oxygen her starved muscles demanded. The skin of her face and neck was leathered by the sun, the dry wind leaving it cracked and peeling. Her shoulders were a permanent knot of tension, a rigid shield against the fatigue that threatened to break her. At night, the exhaustion was so profound that her muscles would tremor uncontrollably, even after she collapsed onto her simple cot. Each morning began with the painful stretching of limbs, the creaking of joints, and the sensation that every bone was being ground to powder. But the pain wasn't just a burden, it was a guide, a stern teacher reminding her of the body's limits and the necessity of technique. She knew every movement had to be precise, every lever calculated, every footing secure to avoid a crippling injury. Survival depended on her ability to endure, to persevere, and to transcend the limits imposed by nature itself. Her object of power, the heart of her philosophy and resilience, was a small journal bound in weather-beaten leather, dated 1852. The pages, thin and yellowed, were filled with elegant, complex script, intricate drawings of geological structures, mathematical calculations of stress and force, and piercing observations on the behavior of the natural world. It was no ordinary diary. It was a compendium of ancestral engineering, passed down through generations of her kin. In this tome, she found the wisdom that set her apart. The philosophy was simple, yet profound. The earth remembers the water, absorbing and retaining patterns of flow and saturation over centuries. It holds the heat, revealing how rock and soil breathe thermal energy. The wind, invisible and omnipresent, had unseen patterns, currents and eddies that could be read and utilized rather than fought. The journal explained how the forces of the universe, gravity, erosion, thermal expansion, shaped the landscape, and how one could work in harmony with them. The pages detailed dry stone masonry not as a rustic craft, but as a precise science. There were diagrams of shear stress in rocks, showing how geological layers shifted under pressure. Other sections discussed axial loads on stone pillars, explaining how to distribute weight so a structure became stronger over time, not weaker. There were even blueprints for drainage systems that mimicked the veins of a leaf, capturing and directing water with such efficiency that they prevented both flood and erosion. The journal was more than a book. It was a silent mentor teaching the forgotten language of the earth. In this world of skepticism and scorn, Anya had only one unquestioning validator, a creature who trusted her without reservation. Cinder, her dog. Cinder was a scruffy mixed-breed shepherd with amber eyes that glowed with an intelligence and loyalty that felt almost human. His instincts were razor-sharp. He could sense changes in the weather long before any barometer. Cinder would growl softly toward the east hours before a storm broke the horizon, or huddle close to Anya when a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure signaled high winds. While the townsfolk called her mad, pointing at her mortarless stones and her mysterious drainage channels, Cinder was her shadow. The dog watched her with unwavering devotion, his lean, strong body always ready to follow her command or simply lie at her feet. His amber gaze affirmed every choice she made. Cinder's trust was a balm for Anya's soul, a constant reminder that there was a deeper truth, an understanding that transcended human cynicism. Anya wasn't just building a house, she was rewriting the geometry of survival. The dry stone masonry she employed was an ancient art, a visceral science. Every fractured limestone block she selected was chosen for its unique contact surfaces and its intrinsic center of gravity. She examined them with calloused hands, feeling the micro fissures and the grain, like a sculptor understanding the soul of the material. The process was meticulous. She fitted the stones so that friction and gravity did the work of mortar, creating a structure that was flexible, yet incredibly resilient. The submerged drainage channels she excavated beneath the foundation were a marvel of hydraulic engineering. They were designed to divert torrential rains, mimicking subterranean streams to ensure the base remained dry and stable. These invisible veins were her first line of defense. Above ground, she engineered microclimates using strategic stone overhangs and broad eaves. These weren't decorative. They were passive engineering solutions to the relentless sun. The overhangs provided shade during the peak heat, dropping the internal temperature by several degrees. The wind, usually a destructive force, was channeled through carefully positioned vents, creating cross-ventilation that cooled the interior without complex machinery. The house was a living stress unit, every stone a vital component in a grand machine. She often worked under the silver light of the moon, the long shadows of the rising walls acting as silhouettes of her silent toil. The rhythmic clink of stone on stone, the hiss of her breath, and the scent of damp minerals were the symphony of her progress. One day, the routine was shattered by the noisy arrival of Sheriff Brody and his men. They reined in their horses just yards from the construction, kicking up a cloud of fine dust. The sheriff dismounted, his boots thudding heavily on the soil. He looked at Anya's house, then at her, with a sneer. He bellowed for all his men to hear that this was the most pathetic thing he'd ever laid eyes on. He called her crazy, said she was building a useless pile of rubble, and claimed it wouldn't last a single rainy season. He jabbed a finger at the walls, calling them loose rocks just waiting to collapse. His men laughed, a chorus of coarse, mocking voices. One of them, a hulking man named Jeb, tossed a pebble at the foundation just to mock its stillness. The sheriff proclaimed the site a disgrace to any builder and told her she was wasting good Montana air on this freak of a building. Anya didn't answer. Her eyes, hardened by injustice, remained fixed on her work. She felt the weight of his words, the public humiliation burning her skin. But beneath the mud and sweat, she felt the strength of the stones in her hands. She kept working, her jaw set, the strike of her hammer against the stone her only reply to the cacophony of contempt. They rode off, but the echo of their laughter lingered in the heat, a persistent reminder of the abyss between arrogance and knowledge. If you feel the weight of this injustice and want to see the mask of arrogance fall, subscribe to the channel now. What happens next will prove that the mud cannot hide the truth forever. The Montana sky, which for days had been as clear and blue as a polished mirror, began to turn. First, a thin haze on the horizon, then clouds that gathered slowly like swollen grey mountains. The atmospheric pressure plummeted. An oppressive silence took hold of the prairie, a silence the animals felt first, scurrying for cover. Then the air began to hum, a low, distant thrum that grew into a roar. The sky darkened rapidly, turning an almost supernatural shade of deep green, a sinister hue that heralded imminent doom. The great storm, as it would come to be known, arrived with the fury of a cyclone. It wasn't just a gust of wind, it was a spiral of destruction that swallowed everything in its path. The roar was deafening, a primal scream that made the earth itself tremble. Dust, branches, and shingles became lethal projectiles. The town's conventional buildings, erected in haste with little regard for resilience, began to groan. Roofs were peeled back like orange skins. Wooden walls buckled and twisted. Panic spread like wildfire. Men and women scrambled for cover, their screams swallowed by the howling gale. Sheriff Brody, who spent his days barking orders, was paralyzed by fear. He had sought refuge in his own home, a grand, ostentatiously decorated structure built with heavy timber and mortar. It was now a shuddering fortress. He stood in his parlor, his face white as chalk, watching the walls crack and hearing the sickening snap of wood. His bravado had disintegrated, replaced by a glacial terror. The sheriff's house, the symbol of his power, began to collapse in on itself, tiles flying off like dry leaves. While the town plunged into chaos, Anya acted with an eerie calm. Her house, the sheriff's useless pile of stones, stood unmoved, nestled into the earth. Its deep foundations and interlocking dry stone walls acted as a seismic fortress. The stones, perfectly fitted, allowed for micro-movements that absorbed the wind's energy, dissipating the pressure rather than rigidly resisting it. The heavy, sloped roof, secured with hand-forged steel cables, refused to lift. But the disaster was larger than her own home. The community water tower, a towering wooden structure that served the entire settlement, was starting to give way. One of its support pillars, weathered by years of neglect and now hammered by the storm, was splintering. If the tower fell, the town's water supply would be severed for months. No one moved. They were all hypnotized by the impending crash. Anya saw the point of failure. In 90 seconds, she sized up the situation. She realized the failing pillar was creating an unstable force vector that would topple the whole structure. She had to redistribute the load. Racing into the teeth of the wind, ignoring the flying debris, she grabbed a heavy iron bar and a robust timber she'd kept for emergencies. She didn't scream orders. She simply acted. With the precision of a surgeon and the strength of a mason, she jammed the iron bar under the base of a secondary pillar, using the timber as a fulcrum. She used applied physics, understanding the force vectors and the torsional balance of the tower's weight. In one brutal, swift motion, she leveraged the bar, shifting the base of the secondary pillar just enough to catch the load from the collapsing main support. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was enough to stabilize the tower. The groaning of the wood subsided. The collapse was averted. The people watching from their makeshift shelters stared in absolute shock, their faces lit by intermittent lightning, seeing Anya's silhouette against the fury, a lone figure who had stared down chaos with intelligence and courage. In the days following the Great Storm, the town was a vista of devastation. Structures were reduced to kindling, and mud covered everything like a funeral shroud. Sheriff Brody's house, a monument to his ego, was now a pathetic heap of splintered wood and broken brick. Only Anya's house stood untouched, a beacon of resilience amid the ruin. As the town began to lick its wounds, a gleaming black carriage pulled by 2 obsidian stallions arrived. It looked as though it belonged to another world, polished and pristine. From the carriage stepped a man of imposing stature, dressed in a dark suit and a charcoal felt hat. His hair was silver at the temples, and his piercing blue eyes radiated authority. This was Sterling Thorne, the Federal Inspector of Public Works, a legendary figure in the world of structural engineering, known for his ability to sniff out true talent. Thorne didn't waste time with the disorganized local officials or Sheriff Brody, who was visibly shaken and trying in vain to maintain appearances among the wreckage of his home. Instead, the inspector walked straight to Anya's stone house. He examined the structure with an expert's eye, running his hands over the stone, noting the perfect joins and the drainage channels exposed by the storm. He paused, thoughtful, and then walked toward Anya, who was busy organizing the distribution of salvaged water. Sterling Thorne did not address her as girl or amateur. He called her Miss Sterling, with a deference that made everyone present gasp. His voice was deep and resonant with genuine respect as he spoke of her structural genius and undeniable expertise. He praised her work as a masterpiece of resilient design that had weathered a cyclone without a single stone out of place. It was then that Anya's true identity was laid bare. With a calculated gesture, Inspector Thorne pulled a silver medallion from his pocket, identical to the compass Anya carried. He declared, to the town's bewilderment, that Anya was not just some squatter, she was Anya Sterling, one of the nation's leading experts in geotechnics and dry stone masonry, a prodigy who had walked away from academia and the big cities. He explained that the Sterling family were master builders for generations, their philosophies kept in journals and compasses passed from one to the next. She had chosen anonymity to prove a point, to build without the shackles of convention and let her work speak for itself. The shock on Sheriff Brody's face was total. His skin turned a deathly white, then flushed a deep, bruised purple. His eyes, once full of mockery, were now hollow. The woman he had publicly humiliated, whom he had branded a lunatic, was a figure of knowledge and authority he could never hope to match. His house was a ruin. Hers was a monument. The reversal of status was complete, ruthless, and irreversible. Weeks turned to months, and time became the final judge. Sheriff Brody's property remained a scar of debris, a pile of trash no one was in a hurry to clear. It was a permanent reminder of his arrogance. He was stripped of his office, his authority eroded by the exposure of his incompetence. His once impeccable uniform was now perpetually dusty, his body hunched under the weight of a failure everyone could see. His bravado had vanished, replaced by a bitter silence. Meanwhile, Anya's useless lot flourished. Her mortarless stone house became a center of life, a model of sustainability. The microclimates she had engineered provided a cool refuge during scorching summers, and her drainage systems made the surrounding soil fertile. Small gardens, once impossible in that arid dirt, began to bloom. The water she skillfully collected was a blessing to all. Anya's house became a gathering place, a bastion of safety where people came to share ideas and build a more resilient future. Her methods, once ridiculed as madness, were now studied and imitated. Her wisdom spread like the seeds she planted. Knowledge is the only thing that grows greater when shared, like water seeping into thirsty earth, bringing forth life and hope. It is a force that expands, multiplying its value with every mind that absorbs it. But for those who live in arrogance and contempt for learning, those who cling to ignorance like a crown of thorns, the truth will always be a barren wasteland, a prison of their own making. If you lived his life, with all its privilege and power, you would not only survive, you would thrive with the wisdom you now possess. You would see the cracks before they formed. But if he were forced to live yours, to face the relentless weather, the back-breaking toil, and the injustice of a blind world, he wouldn't last a single day under that unforgiving sun. His foundation, built on vanity, would be the first to crumble, and his ruin would be the only witness to his fragility. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this waiting for you. Stories about the people the world refused to see until it became impossible to ignore them. Your presence here gives a voice to those who have been silenced.